After experiencing GPS jamming over Bulgaria, did the pilots flying the plane with the president of the European Commission really circle for an hour before having to land using paper maps? Of course they didn't. This story is a very good example of how inaccurate reporting using real information about an actual event can lead to misconceptions and completely wrong conclusions. The primary focus of von der Leyen's trip was to discuss efforts to improve the defense of the European Union in view of the evolving war between Russia and Ukraine. Anyway, from what information that we do have, it seems like this flight started completely uneventfully. The aircraft took off using runway 29, and after that it eventually turned out to a southerly heading, climbing quickly to reach its final cruise altitude of flight level 390 or 39,000 feet. As they then crossed from Poland to Slovakia. Now, the original source for what happened next appears to be an article in the Financial Times, which was published on the 1st of September. In there, we are told that the crew were planning to land using a GPS-based approach, but that they couldn't do it because of GPS interference. The article then goes on to say that the pilots circled the airport for an hour before the pilots decided to land the aircraft manually using analog maps. And later on, the article also describes these as paper maps. That story was then picked up and redistributed globally by dozens of national and international news media and of course hundreds of digital news platforms around the world. They all used different black headlines describing this attack and near emergency, focusing heavily on those paper maps that were described. Now, we don't actually know what kind of interference the pilots in this story was dealing with, but if we look at the GPS jamming map that I told you about before, we can see that on August 31st, the day of this flight, the area around Plovdiv airport in Bulgaria was indeed subject to that type of interference. So I want to be absolutely clear here. My team and I are not disputing the article's claim that the flight was subjected to GPS interference. That much is pretty clear, and Bulgarian authorities did specifically confirm that such interference was at play near the airport. But it was most likely general and not necessarily aimed at this flight specifically. Having said that, there is information in the reporting that is just plain wrong and definitely misunderstood. Specifically, the use of paper maps and the fact that the aircraft was circling for an hour over its destination before landing, which does sound quite dramatic when you hear it. But was it? Well, let's start with that 1 hour circling claim, since that is pretty easy to look into. If we go to Flight Radar 24, we can see that the flight was originally scheduled to take off from Warsaw at 13:30 local time, and it was then expected to land at Plovdiv at 16:18. There is 1 hour time difference between those two cities, which means that the flight was scheduled to last for 1 hour and 48 minutes. So if we compare the actual departure and arrival times, we can see that the flight actually lasted for 1 hour and 57 minutes. That's just 9 minutes longer than expected. So where does this claim of 1 hour of holding time come from? Well, I can only speculate here, but note that the plane departed 1 hour and 7 minutes later than originally planned, and obviously it also therefore landed with a similar delay, which may have had something to do with this. So knowing that, it is clear that the reporting about the flight holding over Plovdiv for an hour is just simply wrong. And some of the websites that initially copied this information later did correct themselves, but many also didn't. In any case, that delay in itself would not have even made the news if it wasn't for the fact that it was combined with the news of the pilots having to use paper maps to get down. So let's have a look at that claim then, shall we? So it is much better to access that type of chart through our electronic flight bags, or EFBs, which are basically company-supplied iPads where these charts are kept up to date electronically. But whether or not these pilots had to use IFR charts in paper form or in tablet isn't really the main issue here, because you probably noticed that I said charts, not maps. That seems to be a pretty big misunderstanding for people outside of aviation, who assumes that our charts are basically the aviation equivalent of the paper maps that we once used for driving. I mean, we replaced those maps with GPS, so pilots replaced their maps with the GPS as well, right? No. Our instrument charts are not primarily made to depict geographical features that we have to find by looking out through our windows. Instead, they are basically instructions on how to execute different types of instrument procedures. Now, there are what's called VFR charts that are exactly what you're thinking about, but that's for visual flights, and we never really use those for commercial operations. We don't even have them available. Now instead, in this case, this crew would have been looking through their normal approach chart for available approaches into runway 30 in Plovdiv, something that we pilots do on every single flight. Before their problems with the GPS interference, they had most likely planned to make an RNP approach for runway 30. RNP stands for Required Navigational Performance, and it is a type of GPS-guided approach which was available for that particular runway. So remember when I said that this crew took an extra 9 minutes to land? Well, that's because that's how long it took for them to select this new approach, brief it, and then position their aircraft accordingly. But beyond that, they basically made a completely uneventful approach towards the airport that they always meant to go to, and I doubt that their pulses even increased a little bit. Now, it is a little bit odd that they asked for radar vectors at an airport with no radar. They should have known that, but that's really nitpicking here. The important thing here is that there are backups, many layers of backups in fact, and we pilots are fully capable of dealing with GPS interference whenever it might occur. So personally, I really hope that journalists out there can start reporting on stories like this just a little bit more carefully. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentour now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.